Trump wants to deploy the National Guard into American cities run by Democrats, not because of a hurricane, not because of a riot the police can't handle, but to enforce local law in peacetime. This is not normal. This is not lawful. And if you think this stops with one city, you are in for a very rude awakening. When you put federal troops into civilian neighborhoods to do police work without a governor's request, without an insurrection, without any of the constitutional guardrails that are supposed to exist, you are not restoring order. You are starting a constitutional earthquake, and the aftershocks will reach every state in this country, red or blue, whether you voted for him or not. Now, I sat in that office for 8 years. I know what the Insurrection Act is. I know the legal threshold it requires. And I know when a president is stretching that law past the breaking point. This proposal does not meet any legitimate test for federal military intervention. It's a political stunt wrapped in the language of public safety. But unlike most political stunts, this one has the potential to shatter the separation between military and civilian authority that has defined American democracy since the founding. So let me walk you through exactly what Trump is proposing, why this crosses a line no modern president has dared to cross in peacetime, and what it means for the next president and the one after that, if we let this precedent stand. Here's the concrete proposal. Trump is suggesting he can deploy National Guard troops into cities like Chicago, Detroit, or Philadelphia, cities controlled by Democratic mayors, to restore law and order. He claims crime is out of control in these places, even when federal statistics show violent crime falling in many of them. He's framing this as emergency action, but here's the problem. There is no emergency that local law enforcement cannot handle. The governors of these states have not asked for help. The mayors don't want federal troops on their streets. And most importantly, the legal justification Trump is using, the Insurrection Act of 1807, was never designed for this. The Insurrection Act allows the president to deploy troops domestically in very narrow circumstances, rebellion, insurrection, or when local authorities explicitly cannot maintain order. It was used during the Civil War. It was used during the Civil Rights Movement when southern states refused to enforce desegregation. But even then, those deployments were temporary, targeted, and explicitly requested by either governors or tied to court orders enforcing federal law. What Trump is proposing is fundamentally different. He wants to send troops into cities that are not in rebellion, that have functioning police forces, and that have not asked for military assistance. He wants to do it unilaterally, and he wants to do it to enforce policies that local governments oppose. That's not emergency response. That's federal occupation. When I was president, we had the Oklahoma City bombing. We had threats from domestic terrorists. We had moments where people demanded I send in troops, declare martial law, crack down hard. But we didn't do that. You know why? Because once you normalize military intervention in civilian life, you don't just solve a problem, you create a bigger one. You teach the next president that the military is just another tool for domestic policy disputes. And you teach the American people that the line between soldier and police officer doesn't really matter. Here's what happens when that line blurs. Soldiers are trained to neutralize threats, not de-escalate community tension. They follow orders from a chain of command that ends at the White House, not from mayors or city councils accountable to voters. They carry weapons designed for combat, not for crowd control. And most importantly, they operate under military law, not civilian oversight. When you put soldiers on city streets to do police work, you are importing a military mindset into situations where force should be the last resort, not the default. Now, let's be clear. Governors have the authority to call up their own state National Guard when they need help. That happens all the time. During natural disasters, civil unrest, emergencies, that's lawful. That's constitutional. The difference here is that Trump wants to federalize those troops, to take them out of the governor's control and put them under his direct command. That is an extraordinary move, and it should only happen in the most extreme circumstances, with clear legal authority and broad consensus that it's necessary. Trump has none of that. No governor is asking for this. No court has ordered it. No congressional authorization supports it. What he has is a political desire to look tough on crime and to humiliate Democratic mayors who won't bend to his will, and he's willing to use the United States military to do it. This isn't about crime. If it were, he'd be working with local leaders, funding community policing, supporting proven interventions. This is about power. It's about showing that a president can override local authority whenever he wants. It's about turning the military into a domestic political weapon, and it's about creating a precedent that will haunt this country long after Trump leaves office. Because here's the thing, once you do this once, it's no longer extraordinary. The next president will look at what Trump did and say, well, he sent troops into Chicago and nothing stopped him, so I can send them into Miami or Dallas or Phoenix. The threshold gets lower every time, and eventually federal troops on American streets become routine. That's not a country I recognize, and it's not a country the founders would recognize either. Democracies have militaries to defend them from external enemies. Authoritarian regimes use military to control their own people. We've spent decades criticizing other countries for doing exactly what Trump is proposing, and now he wants to do it here. So let's talk about the history here, because this is not the first time a president has tried to use the Insurrection Act as a political tool, and every time it's happened, it's left scars. Richard Nixon wanted to use federal troops against anti-war protesters. He didn't get away with it, but the impulse was there. In 1992, George H.W. Bush sent troops into Los Angeles after the Rodney King riots, but that was at the request of the governor after days of violence that local police couldn't contain. Even then, it was controversial. Even then, people worried we were crossing a line, but at least there was a legal process. At least there was an actual emergency. In 2020, Trump wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act during the George Floyd protests. He wanted to send active duty military into American cities to shut down demonstration. His own defense secretary, Jim Mattis, opposed it publicly. His chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, later said it was a mistake for him to even appear in uniform near Lafayette Square that day. The backlash was so intense that Trump backed down, but the desire was there. The instinct to use the military as a domestic political weapon. That instinct has been there for a long time. And now, in 2025, we're watching the same pattern repeat itself. Except this time, Trump isn't backing down. This time, he's learned from his previous failures. He knows that if you move fast enough, if you frame it as public safety, if you make it sound like the only option, you can create facts on the ground before the courts or Congress can stop you. That's the playbook. Declare an emergency, deploy the troops, and anyone to stop you. By the time the lawsuits are filed, by the time constitutional scholars weigh in, the troops are already there. And once they're there, pulling them back looks weak, so they stay. And every day they stay, it becomes a little more normal. This is not a new Donald Trump strategy. This is classic Trump. Bypass the institutions, ignore the experts, treat every constraint as an obstacle to be demolished, not a safeguard to be respected. We saw it with the travel ban. We saw it with the border wall emergency declaration. We saw it with January 6th when he told a mob to march on the Capitol, and then watched it unfold on television. The pattern is always the same. Push boundaries, break norms, dare the system to stop you. But here's what makes this different. When you're talking about deploying troops on American soil, you're not just testing the limits of presidential power. You're fundamentally altering the relationship between the military and the people. You're teaching soldiers that their role includes domestic enforcement. You're teaching police that they can be replaced by federal troops anytime a president decides he doesn't like how a city is being run. And you're teaching governors that their authority over their own states can be overridden whenever it's politically convenient. Let me tell you what happens when those lessons take hold. Soldiers start to see American neighborhoods as operational zones, not communities. Local police feel undermined and demoralized. Governors lose the ability to protect their own people from federal overreach. And citizens, ordinary people just trying to live their lives, they start to see troops on their street corners and wonder when their country stopped being theirs. Now, here's where Trump's defenders will say, but crime is out of control in these cities. Somebody has to do something. And look, I understand that frustration about crime is a real issue. People deserve to feel safe in their neighborhoods. But sending in federal troops is not a solution. It's gasoline on a fire. You want to reduce crime? Fund community policing. Support violence interruption programs. Work with mayors, not against them. Give cities the resources they need to address root causes like poverty, addiction, mental health crisis. You know what doesn't reduce crime? Treating American neighborhoods like occupied territory that creates resentment, fear, and resistance. It damages the trust between police and communities that you need to actually solve crime. And it makes everything worse in the long run because people stop cooperating with law enforcement when they see their city as a battlefield. But this was never really about crime. If it were, Trump would be working with Democratic mayors, not threatening them. He'd be offering federal resources and support, not federal troops. The real goal here is to show that a president can do whatever he wants to whomever he wants and nobody can stop him. That's the precedent he's trying to set, and it's the most dangerous precedent of his entire presidency, because once this becomes normalized, once we accept that a president can federalize troops and send them into cities without a legitimate emergency, without congressional approval, without even the governor's consent, what's next? What happens when a future president decides that protests in Texas need to be shut down? What happens when another president decides that election-related demonstrations in Florida are a threat to public order? You think this power stays confined to Democratic cities? You think it only gets used by Republican presidents? No. Once the taboo is broken, once the precedent is set, it becomes a tool available to anyone who sits in the Oval Office, and that tool gets used more and more frequently until it's just routine. Until we wake up one day and realize we're living in a country where the president can send troops anywhere, anytime, for any reason, and call it law and order. That's not paranoia. That's history. Every democracy that slid into authoritarianism went through a phase just like this, where emergency powers became routine, where military intervention became normal, where the line between protecting citizens and controlling them disappeared. We've watched it happen in other countries. We've criticized it. We've imposed sanctions over it, and now we're flirting with doing it ourselves. The founders designed our system specifically to prevent this. They were terrified of standing armies being used against the people. They wrote the Third Amendment to stop troops from being quartered in homes. They wrote posse comitatus to separate military and civilian law enforcement. They gave governors authority over their own National Guard, precisely so that no president could turn the military into his personal domestic force. Trump wants to undo all of that. He wants to be the president who rewrites the rules, who proves that those old constraints don't matter anymore. And if we let him, if we accept this as normal, then we're not just losing a political fight, we're losing the republic. Now let's talk about what this means for you, because this isn't some abstract constitutional debate. This is about what kind of country your grandchildren are going to inherit. If Trump succeeds in deploying federal troops into American cities without legitimate legal authority, without congressional approval, without even the request of state governors, then the next president will look at that precedent and say, well, and the president after that will push it even further. That's how precedents work. Each violation of norms becomes the new baseline. Each abuse of power becomes standard procedure. Think about what that looks like. In practice, a Democratic president could decide that gun violence in red states justifies federal troop deployment. A Republican president could decide that immigration enforcement requires military occupation of border towns. Any president could decide that protests they don't like, elections they want to control, or local governments they want to punish are fair game for military intervention. Once you open that door, you can't close it. Once you teach presidents that the Insurrection Act is a political tool, not an emergency safeguard, it stays a political tool forever. And here's the part that should terrify anyone who cares about freedom. When troops become routine on American streets, when military authority replaces civilian authority, the entire relationship between citizens and government changes. You stop asking your mayor for help and start fearing federal intervention. You stop trusting that local elections matter because the president can override them anyway. You stop believing that the law protects you because the law clearly doesn't constrain him. That's not America. That's not the country we built. That's not the country people fought and died to preserve. But it's the country Trump wants to create. And if we let him, if we accept this as normal, then we're complicit in our own transformation into something unrecognizable. Now, here's where some people will say, Clinton, you're exaggerating. We have courts, we have Congress, we have checks and balances. And yes, we do. But those institutions only work if people use them. If governors sue and courts rule against Trump, but he deploys troops anyway, what then? If Congress passes legislation to stop him, but he vetoes it and Republicans won't override, what then? If the military follows illegal orders because they're afraid of being punished for refusing, what then? The system only protects us if we protect the system. And right now, we're watching one man stress test every safeguard we've got. He's asking a simple question. Can anyone actually stop me? And so far, the answer has been mixed at best. Some courts have ruled against him. Some have let him proceed. Some governors have resisted. Others have stayed silent. Some members of Congress have spoken up. Most have looked the other way. That mixed response is how democracies die. Not with a bang, but with a shrug. Not because people don't care, but because enough people convince themselves that it's not worth the fight. That maybe this one time, just this once, we can let it slide. That the next election will fix things. That someone else will step up. But nobody else is coming. There is no cavalry. There are only citizens, ordinary people like you, deciding whether they're going to demand accountability or accept the erosion of everything that makes this country worth defending. So let me lay out 3 scenarios for how this plays out. Because the future isn't written yet. The decisions we make in the next few months will determine which path we take. Scenario 1. Trump deploys troops, courts rule against him, and he ignores the courts. Governors refuse to cooperate. Some troops follow orders, others refuse. We end up with a constitutional crisis unlike anything we've seen since the Civil War. Federal authority clashes with state authority. The military becomes politicized. Trust in institutions collapses, and whoever wins that fight, Trump or the governors, the real loser is American democracy because we've proven that the rules don't actually matter when power is determined to break them. Scenario 2. Trump deploys troops, faces immediate backlash, and backs down like he did in 2020. Courts rule it unconstitutional. Congress threatens to cut funding. Public opinion turns sharply against him. He declares victory, claims he made his point, and withdraws. That's the best case scenario, but even in that scenario, he's shown that a president can threaten this kind of action and get away with it politically. He's normalized the conversation. He's made the next attempt easier, and eventually, some president, maybe not Trump, but someone after him, will succeed where he failed. Scenario 3. We stop this before it starts. Governors make clear they'll sue immediately. Congress passes legislation explicitly restricting the use of the Insurrection Act. Courts issue preemptive rulings clarifying that what Trump is proposing is illegal. Military leaders make clear they won't follow unconstitutional orders, and public pressure from citizens, from veterans, from constitutional conservatives and civil libertarians alike makes it politically impossible for Trump to proceed. That's the scenario where American democracy survives intact, but it requires all of us to act. Now, I want to be very clear about what I'm asking you to do. I'm not asking you to protest. I'm not asking you to break any laws. I'm asking you to pay attention. To call your representatives Republican or Democrat doesn't matter, and tell them this is unacceptable. To support governors who are willing to resist unconstitutional federal overreach, to demand that courts act quickly and decisively when these lawsuits are filed, to vote in 26 for candidates who understand that no president should have this kind of power. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires participation. And right now, it requires courage. The courage to say that some lines cannot be crossed, that some powers are too dangerous to normalize, that the president, any president, is not above the law. Here's my final thought. When I was president, I had extraordinary power. I could order military strikes. I could deploy troops overseas. I could reshape policy with the stroke of a pen, but I also knew where the limits were. I knew that certain things were off limits, not because someone could physically stop me, but because they violated the principles that made the office legitimate in the first place. I knew that if I crossed those lines, I wouldn't be strengthening the presidency, I'd be destroying it. Trump doesn't think that way. He sees limits as challenges. He sees constraints as insults, and he sees American cities as battlegrounds where he can prove that nobody can tell him no. So let me end with a simple question, one that every American needs to answer for themselves. Do you believe the president should have the power to send federal troops into any city he wants, whenever he wants, without a legitimate emergency, without congressional approval, without the governor's request? Yes or no? Because that's the precedent Trump is trying to set. And if we don't stop it now, that precedent becomes permanent. The answer you give to that question will determine what kind of country we leave behind. Choose carefully.